Okay, does this work? Oh, yes, suddenly silence. So, I think most of you know who I am. I'm Marty Reineke, and president of COV&R. And we have a little business to conduct. I am, I'm going to sound like everybody's mom, and I'm actually old enough now to be a host. All of your moms. So this building is one of the most important buildings in Mexico City. Dates from 1583, and it is a center for the cultural heritage of Mexico City. It is not a school. At one time it was, but it's not anymore, even though the most famous artists, poets, writers were students here, and many went on to teach here. So it's a museum, and all the people that meet in the halls are museum employees. And for all of us who've been in art museums, you know the employee's main job is to make sure that the heritage that's on the walls of the sculpture is protected. So there's been some misunderstandings about that here, and the key to resolving that is that if we have any questions about the conference, the people affiliated with the conference are a very tiny group. They consist of Tanya. The catering company has been hired out, so you can ask them questions about the food. And then we have our technology company. But all the employees are museum employees, and just as if you were at the Met, you would not be asking one of the persons in one of the exhibition rooms for water or food or whatever. They are not people we interact with except to be very respectful. And so when they ask us to do something or not do something, such as not bring water into this room, then we want to be very respectful of that. And what I've noticed being here, I've spent quite a bit of time walking the halls and looking at the murals, and the pride in this building by the people who work here is really very moving, and they are noticing us. So they notice when we stop and look at the murals and what we say. So the short thing here is if you have an opportunity to thank anyone for their work here, do so. If under any possible stretch of imagination you think you may have been brusque with an employee or asked them something that was not appropriate, if you see them again, to apologize, because we want to be good citizens here of the great honor we have for being in this building. So thank you very much, and I'll hand this over to you for our program.
Hi everyone, welcome back. We will begin our, I think it's our sixth plenary session, and our keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker, is Professor Jorge Márquez. He's an academic, researcher, and professor of the postgraduate and undergraduate program at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, noted for his academic career and his commitment to teaching at a higher level. He has published more than 40 articles in social sciences journals and just over 7 books of his own authorship and co-authorship with other academics, among which we find Envy and Politics in Ancient Greece, Envy and Politics from the Middle Ages to the 18th century and beyond all economics. Please welcome Professor Jorge Márquez.
Muchas gracias, Tania. Es un honor estar aquí hoy hablando de este tema. para que sea fácil seguir la conferencia. This is the reception of Plenary in Mexico. To prepare this text, I have recently spoken with the valuable colleagues, enthusiastic readers and writers who have dealt with Girard ideas, especially with Juan Manuel Escamilla, James Anderson, and Carlos Mendoza. I also chat with Humberto Beck, and more than 2 decades ago with Jose Maria Girard. May he rest in peace. My sincere thanks to all of them. It has not been easy to track reception of our authors in Mexico. I should mention that none of the people I originally planned to speak with to prepare this text currently live in Mexico. Escamilla resides in Edinburgh, Alison in Madrid, and Carlos Mendoza in Boston. It is also worth mentioning that only 2 of them are Mexican. They give us a series of clues that I will develop in my presentation. First, Girard reception in Mexico has been very scarce, and 2, those who have followed the author from Avignon have found greater facilities for the Girardian studies abroad than in Mexico. 3, in Mexico there are no schools, not even a Girardian school, or rather individual, focused and limited efforts that, 4, fortunately, since 2015, they have begun to connect to generate a small network, and this has been achieved paradoxically thanks to foreigners and meetings abroad. According to a review of texts, the interviews carried out on my memory with Girard, I noticed 3 modalities in the reception of Girard work in Mexico. The first, diffuse and indirect reception, which began at the end of the 60s. Here are Jose Maria Girard, the translations of Ivan Illich's texts that refer to Girard, the influence of Jean-Pierre Dupuy on Jean Robert, and a very long etc. of authors who cite Girard as an ingredient of something else. They are neither interested in his work globally, nor do they assume his focus. The second type of reception is the introductory one, which began in the late 90s and lasts until today. The third modality is the use of Girardian theory for the analysis of various topics, which began in this center. In the last 2 modalities, the ramifications of Girardian thought are distinguished in 3 different spaces. The circle of Illichians in Ocotepec, Cuernavaca, the Universidad Iberoamericana, and the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. The protagonists of these modalities have been Jorge and Escamilla in the circle of Illichians, Carlos Mendoza and James Anderson and Girard, and me at the end. The diffuse and indirect modality. Regarding the first modality, it is worth mentioning that it is likely that the first Mexican who read Girard was Jose Maria Girard, an assistant to Ivan Illich during the 60s. In the late 60s, when Girard was very young, he studied sociology of knowledge in Paris. At that time, he was influenced by the Marxist author Michel Goldman. Goldman told him about Girard and encouraged him to read the Saint-Romain. It is well documented that Goldman was very interested in this work. After that misty reference from his birth, nothing more was heard of Girard among Mexicans or in Mexico until the mid-70s. Jean Robert, a Swiss activist who fought against the destruction of cities due to the excessive use of automobiles, describes that in 1972 he arrived in Cuernavaca, Mexico, to meet Ivan Illich. He began working with the philosopher at the study center. Shortly after Robert's arrival at CEDOC, Jean-Pierre Dupuy introduced himself. Robert says, together we prepare a book. In the morning he worked, French editorial office of medical nemesis. And in the afternoon, he and I prepared a book called La Traición de la Opulencia, and which was published in France, and he, Robert says, that motivated my trip to Paris, where we finished. The importance of all this lies in the fact that in La Traición de la Opulencia, we find the first written reference to René Girard in Mexico and by a Mexican. Here remember that Girard chose to be Mexican and live in Mexico almost all his life, despite being born in Switzerland. However, the book is by two authors, and the text refers to Girard out of the good interests rather than Robert's. And it is important to consider that the reference to Girard was not in the original version in French of 1976, but just in the Spanish annotation of 1979. Thus, a brief reference to La Violence was made to reinforce the idea that the choice of the emissary victim is arbitrary, as are the essential concepts of economic doctrines. This is the cover of that translation. This is how Girard entered print in Mexico, through Dupuy, who wrote with Robert in an Illichan environment. It is worth mentioning that the text had little success in Mexico, and that outside the circle of intellectuals that surrounded Illich, it was really read. That is to say, the reference to Girard remained as a piece of archaeology, ready to be dusted off a building later and nothing more. It is also worth mentioning that Ivan Illich's circle in Mexico was mostly made up of foreigners. Discussions there usually took place in French or English. So in 1979, a reference to Girard was published for the first time in Mexico, but it ascended very little in the country. Shortly afterwards, the text also written in Mexico by Illich himself, some other references to Girard appear. The footnotes in Shadow War and Gender stand out. In both books, Girard, along with Dupuy and Dumonchet, appears in footnotes as a reference for understanding mimetic desire. Once again, this is a marginal reference from a foreign author, although written in Mexico, and whose books were translated and read in this country. However, the reading of these books in Mexico correlate with the translation into Spanish in 1990 of Gender and of Shadow War. Also, in the mid-90s, more precisely at the end of 1993, I remember reading and discussing for a social theory class at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at UNAM, Violence in the Cell. Professor Luis Alberto Ayala, later a key player in the formation of the Sexto Piso Publishing House, had also quoted Girard's book in his thesis for his degree in political science. It was a thesis about Ernest Becker. Once again, we find here faint traces of Girard in Mexico and not the broad reception of his thought. In the mid-90s, once again with the help of a foreigner, James Allison, almost Mexican, formally was introduced Girard thought in Mexico. Firstly, the English taught a course at the Universidad about the author of Autónoma. It was the first time that a course on Girard was taught in Mexico. In 1995, in the Journal of the Dominicans in Mexico, Anamnesis, the article account of the bill was published, in which Allison proposes a form of theological interpretation based on the work of Girard. Although the author is not mentioned in the text, his approach is used to understand the rivalry of the enemy brothers, Cain and Abel, Romulus and Remus. Likewise, in the bibliography, Allison says, if anyone is interested in the approach that I have want to offer, the following books may be useful to deepen what is suggested here. And below is a list of 9 books of Girard. the introductory modality. And we see, except for the brief seminar given by Allison and his small text of analysis, all reference to Girard until the 90s were incidental. Our author was not the center of any debate, but only a complement or footnote to other authors for arguments that were often far removed from Girard's own interest. In the third decade of the 21st century, two Mexican academics began the work of disseminating and discussing Girard thought, one at the WIA and the other at the UNAM. In these two spaces, both the introduction and the debate of Girardian thought gained importance. At the WIA, led by Carlos Mendoza, a group was formed that discussed and used Girard's thought. However, once again, foreign thinkers were required to make this possible. In fact, the Girardian School of the WIA was formed by the South American Cesar de Castro Rocha, Javier Solarte, and the Frenchman Stéphane Nolo, two of them here. At the UNAM, my work consisted in the first years of the millennium of three texts to introduce Girard's work and a translation of the interesting article by Jean-Pierre Dupuy about Illich and Girard. In the year 2000, an extraordinary meeting occurred in Oakland. The civil organization, We the People, run by Jerry Brown, then mayor of Oakland, former governor of California, arranged a meeting between Illich and Girard. Dupuy brought Girard from Palo Alto to Oakland, and at a huge table, where there were more than 20 people, the dialogue began. Three Mexicans were present, Jorge, Humberto Beck, and Jose Maria. For the occasion, Jean-Pierre Dupuy prepared the text, The Tour and Sacrifice, Iván Illich and Girard. Jean Robert and Jose Maria had the manuscript. Upon returning to Mexico, they shared it with me, and a few years later, they asked me to translate it into Spanish. In English, the essay was published twice. In Spanish, the text was published in 2003 in a series of tribute texts to Iván Illich. This is the cover of the book. In 2010, Javier Cecilia, a central figure of the last stage of the Illichian Circle of Cuernavaca, published in journal Conspiratio a criticism of the Church, a text in which he insisted on the parallels between Illich and Girard. Back in 2003, Razón Cínica published my text, The Originality of Imitating. It was an electronic journal published at that time in the UNAM Political Science Journal. A longer and improved version of that essay was published in the book Más allá de lo económicos. It is a text of more than 20 pages, an introduction to the work of the Avignon philosopher. The meaning of this text is that it is the first time in Mexico that 60% Girard taught in a comprehensive, general way. In this book, there is also an essay about the Dupuy and the Michel interpretation of economic theory. A little earlier, in 2004, the journal Ixtus published another essay by me in which he summarized Girard's work, Violence or the Sacred. Ixtus was a publication that preceded Conspiratio. Both belong to the Illichian Circle of Cuernavaca. In 2008, works by Girard were published for the first time in Mexico. This is a transcription of an interview that Carlos Mendoza made with the author of Scapegoat. It was published on the website of the Letras Libres journal, where Humberto Beck used to work. Since Girard said very little about Mexico, a brief quote is worth recovering. Carlos Mendoza said, "Can massacres like Cacteal in Mexico and so many in the war have another meaning than the sole balance of antagonism between rivals to be designed to annihilate one against another? This increasing resignation between further executioners? What Christian memory is it possible to make of these victims that don't remain passivity in the face of injustice, violence, and death? Neither. It is only possible to recover that memory of the massacre without attributing it an archaic sacrificial meaning. Facing with the suffering of the innocent, we have nothing left but indignation. This type of tragic events, it is not foreign to me, although I must say that it is not part of the immediate problem in which I have built my thoughts. But we must insist on the importance of acting to overcome the causes of this suffering and death, without giving in to resentment that is expressed as a desire for revenge. With the above, I do not mean that we must renounce action to try to change the meaning of domestic violence. The question is whether the use of violence to improve the world can be legitimate. This aspect of liberation theology was called into question a couple of decades ago by some statements by church magisterium. The Christian thought that persists as an intelligent response to a situation of injustice and violence to which entire nations are subject is totally reasonable and legitimate with the new expressions that Christianity can take in these circumstances. Perhaps we must recognize that the Latin American people are right outraged as not sensing a sense of hope in the actions of the state or in the traditional attitude of the churches. We must not forget that in the West Christianity failed as much as modern nationalism, and that is why I observe during this extreme violence that threatens not only humanity, but also the entire planet. The texts published by Mexican publishers, by Girard, are only three. The interview above, Geometries of Desire, published by the Mexican publishing house Sexto Piso, founded by graduates of UNAM Faculty of Political Social Sciences, including a former student Jorge Márquez, and three, Hidden Things in the Foundation of the World, published in collaboration with Ediciones Siguen from Spain and Epidermis from Mexico, and which was also translated by the Mexican Italia. This is the cover, and this is the cover, and then the cover of Materias de Deseo. In 2010, also in the journal Letras Libres, a review of Claudio translation was published, whose Spanish edition was called Clausewitz en los Extremos. The review was made by Enrique Lynch, an author not specialized in eclectic theory. His text addresses the work in a general way and makes a superficial criticism of the book's apocalyptic tone and Girard's phobias. In Mexico, a review by Jorge Márquez of Archibald Improved Translation was also published in 2023. This translation has a title close to the French original, Acabar a Clausewitz. The review highlights the novelties of the 2023 edition, the advantages of the new translation, while contextualizing the work in the general framework of Girard. In 2013, one of the editors of Conspirator, and also close to the Illichian circle of Cuernavaca, obtained a bachelor's degree in philosophy at the Universidad Panamericana with the thesis, God is there, we have killed him, knowledge about sacrifices in the art and exposition of medical theory. It is a magnificent introductory exposition of Girard's work in just over 100 pages. Also, by Escamilla, is a text Preamble to Innovation and Repetition by Girard, published in 2018. That same year, another introductory text of Girard's work was published in the journal Anthropica. The author, Anabel Muñoz Trejo, was a student of Jorge Márquez in the political science. She also prepared her master and doctoral thesis at UNAM on the top of religion. In 2020, The first introductory work was published in Mexico, not to René Girard, but to mimetic theory. Jorge Márquez, Arturo Cárdenas, and Andrea Palacios, Anatomy of Mimetic Theory. The book was co-published by UNAM and Los Ventos, where Juan Manuel Escamilla is the publisher. Regarding this book, a quote taken from the review published in the magazine Tópicos is worth mentioning. This work by Márquez Muñoz and his co-authors honor the thought of René Girard by trying to project it toward new horizons and trying to provide it with a philosophical precision that Girard himself did not intend. It also takes advantage of what many of Girard's most renowned commentators have put on the table. Pala, Paula, Julian, Michel, and Boy, among others, are cited. The latter is the most used precisely because of the intention of political economic application of the term. It is also because of this approach that the section of monarchy stands out a lot, already in the second part of the book titled Conflict and Violence, which delves into what Girard explained in Jorge and the expiatory role of the kings is it, but also the possible deification of the executioner. The logical and real possibilities of the deification of the victim or the endless deferral of his final surrender or the conversion of the violence that resulted, etc., are addressed as the authors themselves mentioned. This is essential for a deep understanding of the dynamics between political force. This is the cover designed by Manuel Escamilla Publishing House. The third modality, using Girard and mimetic theory. In Mexico, a text by Dupuy was published before Girard. Not only this, but Dupuy's influence in Mexico was in many ways abroad for some years at Girard's. This for the following. One of the introducers of Girard taught in Mexico was Dupuy. Dupuy and Jean Robert worked together in la tradición de la opulencia and maintained constant communication. Robert influenced Illich and Sicilia, Jorge Márquez, and Juan Manuel Escamilla. 3. Through Robert, some of us had access to la tradición, and he also gave me a copy of the third. It's a book, classic book of Dupuy and Michel. In this modality, that of the use of mimetic theory for analysis, there are 4 types of texts. Those of world history, those who analyze Mexican politics, those that analyze aspects of the social reality of Mexico, and those of theoretical debate. World history. Let's start with the first category, since that is where we have the most text. The first Mexican texts in the Girard works were used not incidentally, or rather on one of the interpretative basis, was Jorge Márquez's master thesis from 2011, which analyzes political history of Greece from mimetic theory in 3 stages: Homeric, Classic, and Hellenistic. This work was later expanded and published by Libros and Red, Publishing House, Buenos Aires, in 2005 with the name Política y Imperia en Latinoamérica. The 2001 thesis was the first of Jorge Márquez in a series of political history texts analyzed with mimetic theory. Subsequently, his doctoral thesis is a mimetic theory analysis of political evolution from Middle Ages to the European 17th century, an expansive and revised version of this text, which also included an analysis of the European 18th century, was published in 2009 under the name Imperia y Política. Here is my publisher, Jorge. In addition to these 2 theses converted into books, Jorge Márquez also published 3 other texts on the world history analyzed of mimetic theory. The first of them, Las claves de la gobernabilidad. This one there's a translation. For the analysis of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and a series of political models is carried out. In this text, Jorge Márquez, in addition to using the categories of mimetic theory, René Girard, Girard, and Autónoma, contributes his own to the modalities of violence and the containment of violence are always the case. Then, there are two styles, Sociedad, Violencia y Poder, where a social historical analysis is made that begins in primitive societies and concludes at the beginning of the 21st century. The first volume was authored by Jorge Márquez, Alma Iglesias, and Pablo González Ulloa, all three of whom are professors at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences in the University. The second volume is by Jorge Márquez. The two volumes are a study that combines mimetic theory with the social historical theory of Michael Mann, with the social history of war by John Keegan, with the political history of war by Victor Hanson. This is the cover of the first volume, and then is the cover of the second volume. Finally, there are two volumes of Tiempos Miméticos, reviewed in a Mexico Social, and translated by James Allison for Overall Bulletin. A brief quote from the review is appropriate to get an idea of the text. We are given the history of the 20th century and analysis of the categories of mimetic theory, not the whole of the 20th century, but from the end of the First World War until the dismemberment of the Soviet Union. Given that the possible sources from which to narrate such a history are infinite, Márquez concentrates only on the vision of Paul Johnson. This seems a good choice for analysis based on mimetic theory. First, because Johnson was a historian of the first rank and a master for other great contemporary historians. And second, because Johnson constructed history of the 20th century with a huge amount of biographical data and strips naked the rivalries and mimetic inspirations of the great personalities of the time. Johnson narrates history by means of flesh and blood people. This is just what mimetic theory also seeks, clean as it does from great metaphysical figures. This it calls romantic lies. The two volumes of Tiempos Miméticos constitute a very extensive work of nearly 800 pages that, according to the reviewer, has a special value in that it shows the potential of mimetic theory for the analysis of politics. Each chapter this is a quote of the reviewer. Each chapter is a stand-alone essay. We are given a combination of theory, history, abstraction, and human beings in action. Together they yield a tale well told, even when it is recounting the worst atrocities. The quotations from Paul Johnson and those of the authors inspired by mimetic theory are naturally complementary. It would even seem on occasion that the authors of the mimetic observers had Johnson and prior knowledge of mimetic theory, though it was not fact the case. This is the front of my cover. This is the second volume. It is worth mentioning that, like Anatomía de la Teoría Mimética, Juan Manuel Escamilla was responsible for the editing of Tiempos Miméticos. It is also worth noting that in these volumes we already see a new generation of young professors and graduate students studying mimetic theory, among them Aranza Rubio, Emilio Villanueva, and Palmira Arias. Furthermore, in the group of these young researchers interested in mimetic theory, this is worth mentioning Alejandro Dominguez, who wrote 3 theses about Girard. Moisés Pérez Mercado, Gustavo Lasguerra. The first has presented a thesis to obtain bachelor's degree in political science by Jorge Márquez, and which is titled Los rituales de la sucesión presidencial en México, una revisión histórica dada a la luz de la teoría mimética. The second, Gustavo, has prepared several chapters in the book in progress, Tiempos Miméticos, volume 3, los 90. And finally, Palmira Arias and Aranza Rubio again. They are working political and historical subjects in the master's degree thesis using mimetic theory. Second modality, Mexican politics seen by mimetic theory. Regarding the text that uses mimetic theory for the analysis of Mexican politics, the following 3 stand out. Jorge Márquez and Pablo González Ulloa, Los retos de la gobernabilidad en México, where the Mexican political system is analyzed around the problem of violence and the containment of violence. Furthermore, in the chapter titled Political Social Attitudes, a typology of attitudes of Mexican citizens is constructed based on categories of leadership. Second, Elecciones 2018, una interpretación desde la termimética, which one reviewer describes like this. The work of Dr. Márquez and Andrea Palacio Soto outlines the interpretation of elections in Mexico from the mimetic theory postulated by the French philosopher and historian Girard. And three, also written by Jorge Márquez and Pablo González, is the essay on the populism of the Mexican president López Obrador, titled Morning Conferences from Dialogue to the Sacrificial Right and the Formation of Scapegoats. These are the covers of some of the books. 3. The social reality of Mexico seen by mimetic theory. Regarding the reception of Girard work in Mexico in texts that analyze aspects of Mexican social reality, it is worth mentioning first the book compiled by Carlos de Mendoza, Caminos de Paz. It is appropriate to make a parenthesis around this work. It is composed of essays that clearly unite two schools, the Inician of Cuernavaca and the Guia, are the texts by both Mexicans and foreign authors. It is also worth mentioning that the antecedent of this work was the international colloquium that was held at the Guia and in San Cristobal Las Casas, Chiapas, in August 2012. The journalist and President Concha commented on the theoretical. I'm going to skip some parts because I have just some minutes. The colloquium and later Mendoza's book sought to contribute to the peace process in Mexico and Latin America, and region that is experienced wars of different types, and that has become accustomed to levels of violence that were once intolerable. This, in the 2016 book, we find five sections: academic take reconciliation, Chiapas, historical violence, crisis of the system and process of social construction, gender violence. The text combines experts and laymen in mimetic theory, academics, religious people, and social actors interested in the peace and reconciliation class. Among the academics participate Carlos Mendoza, James Allison, João César Castro, Roberto Solarte, and Girard, among others. Regarding religious and social actors, there are Carlos Lapuente and the Mexican Dominican Bishop Raúl Vera. This is the book cover of the book by Carlos Mendoza. We began with this work because of its impact on social analysis of the conflict in Mexico and for its contribution on the ground as a practical proposal for pacification. In second place, two works from 2017 stand out. First, the translation of the important book by João César, Culturas Shakespeareanas. One of the central themes of the book is the social and cultural inequalities and asymmetries in Latin America, which make the victims in our region invisible. César de Castro book is such an important reference that same year the Guia published a tribute text. Carlos Mendoza coordinated the book Mimesis e Invisibilización, which contained essays that analyze and deepen the arguments of Cultura Shakespeareana. I'm going to skip this. Also, in a theoretical field about Mexican reality, we find other texts from the Girard circle. I'm going to talk as fast as possible. This is the one, the cover, you can see the cover. This one is about organized crime. And in the next page, it's another about organized crime. So this organized crime, the second volume. And finally, I'm going to show you there are some publications of the theoretical debate, but I want to skip to the next page before I stop the talk and go for the next page, the formation of the network of Mexican Girardians. I would like to finish with this because of the time. Finally, it is worth mentioning something about the strange connections of the Mexican Girardians. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, the Girard topic is very known in Mexico. On the other hand, its impetus is due largely to the work of foreign thinkers. Regarding the connection of the Girardes and Mexico, let us say the following. The Girardes of the Guia are an important part of the work of James Allison. The Girardes of the Illichan Circle, Cuernavaca, no Girard Tributary. The Girardes of the Union also are subdued to the influence of the Mexican Illichan, and was Jose Maria's very research system for several years. Despite being located just a few kilometers from each other, the three Mexican circles of Girardes began to approach each other in the United States. In 2015, COV&R was held at San Luis University in July. There, two Mexicans attended, Pablo González Jr. and me. We met Father Miguel, an American priest who had lived and preached in Mexico. At the same time, he introduced them to James Allison. Allison also lived for a few years in Mexico. A strong intellectual and friendly bond then began between the four. The following year, Allison invited me, a person Girard taught at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at Autónoma. During that visit, Allison simultaneously introduced Carlos Mendoza to me. Also at the San Luis Congress, González and I met Wolfgang Pfannenfeld, whom they have read with enthusiasm for several years. In 2017, during the COV&R held at the Francisco de Vitoria University in Madrid, Allison introduced Juan Manuel Escamilla to me. Allison later, in 2023, returned to UNAM to teach a seminar on mimetic theory, power and change. In February 2018, in the Political Social Science graduate program at UNAM, Pfannenfeld taught a course on religion. I have no more time. This is a photograph of Pfannenfeld when he visited first time Mexico with Emilio Cárdenas. And finally, the next, just show some of the pictures. Next. Me. And finally, it is something we did at UNAM, Moro, Solarte, and Kipui, and that's the reception of the year in Mexico until now. And this is that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Márquez. So we are a little rushed, and we will leave the space for questions and answers till we go the next lecture. I am very honored to introduce to you Claudio Lomnitz. He is the Plenary Professor and Chair of the Anthropology Department at Columbia University. Prior to teaching in Columbia, Lomnitz was a distinguished university professor of anthropology and chair of the Committee on Historical Studies at the New School for Social Research in New York. His deep engagement with the study of historical and social structures in Latin America has produced quite a number of notable publications, some of which are Deep Mexico, Silent Mexico, an Anthropology of Nationalism, Exits from the Labyrinth, and Death and the Idea of Mexico. In 2020, he was elected member of Mexico's Colegio Nacional, the highest honor for Mexican academics. His most recent book deals with the subjacent theology of the drug cartels in Mexico. Its title is Towards a Political Theology of Organized Crime. Please welcome Professor Claudio Lomnitz.
Well, thank you so much.
much. I wanted to begin by thanking the organizers for their invitation, in particular Francisco Castro and Daniel Chechi. I'm truly delighted to be here. I didn't even know of the existence of this organization, and I have the disadvantage that I'm currently living in Mexico City. I didn't come for the conference. As a result, I've only been to parts of it, but the parts of it that I've heard has made a mark on me, and I hope to come to future meetings of the organization. I've learned a lot. My only connection to Girard probably fits into the category of sort of incidental and superficial knowledge. Nonetheless, I think it's the case that I've been arrested by the knowledge that I do have, and I hope to be able to deepen it. My aims in the recent work that I'm going to speak out of today, are really not to make any kind of theoretical contribution to literature, but rather to help elucidate what the most vexing forms of violence that plague contemporary Mexico. That's been my aim. And as Tania just mentioned, I've been doing that through the platform of Ecologia Nacional, which is an institution that's about 100 yards up the street from here. And those of you who are doing tourism might want to stop by because it's a beautiful 17th century, it's in a beautiful 17th century convent. But right next to it is actually quite a remarkable small Baroque church, just right up the street. But that institution, the members of that institution have the obligation of giving a set of public lectures every year. And I've been doing that since my induction to the institute. And they've resulted in the publication so far of these two books. And the Sociedad Nacional, which was the current social fabric, which was 2021 lectures up there. And de Girard or political theology of organized crime. The first one is about to appear in English with the University Press in a literal translation under the title of Sovereignty and Extortion. And what I'm going to speak to you from is the second one. I'm comparing the English language version, which, contrary to the first volume, is an edited and augmented version, which I hope to do with my publishers at Zone Books. So my talk today stems from this second project about political theology of organized a crime. And the book, in its English version, which, as I said, is going to be a bit longer than just the lectures that we did at the Nacional, is divided into three parts. The first part is on moral subversion, in which I deal with the arc of what I call the new cannibalism in Mexico. That's the chapter that I'm going to be reading to you from is from that section. The second part is to do with subject formation, and the third part is to do with commandment and hegemony. I want to summarize very briefly the arc of transformation around this rise of the new cannibalism before reading, because otherwise the text that I'm going to share with you is not incomprehensible, since it's the second of three chapters. So the first, my first incursion is that the first chapter is a very close study of what was the first kind of media scandal around cannibalism in the contemporary period, which was the case that was known as the so-called narco-satanics. It was a press scandal in 1989 that at the time was received as kind of a little bit along the lines of Reverend Jones and the Kool-Aid in Guyana kind of thing, sort of lit. It was a big media scandal. It made a big impression. The alleged sect that have been doing this human sacrifice and cannibalism that was dubbed, misnamed actually, narco-satanics. They were not, it was not a satanic sect. Was actually a little group around a figure who was a santero, a Cuban-American a Santeria priest of the Palo Mayombe branch of Santeria, which is often very connected to sort of black magic. But what was interesting about it, and this was not at all visible at the time of the media scandal, I actually remember it because I was living in Mexico at the time. It was that this priest was actually in the service of the so-called Gulf cartel. It was the first, one of the first development of a modern cartel. Just for background, basically, in Mexico, the drug trade, the drug trafficking in Mexico up until the mid-80s had been about the export of two products, marijuana and heroin, and both of which are grown in Mexico. So most of the trafficking was by producers and smugglers across the border. In the mid-80s, the cocaine trade started coming through Mexico, and that's the moment when you get the development of a new social organizational form that takes up the name cartel, or to which the name cartel is applied. But it is actually quite different from the more artisanal forms of drug trafficking that had been prevalent in Mexico for almost 100 years, whatever, 80 years or so. So the Gulf cartel, which is located on its birthplace is on the Texas-Tamaulipas border, in other words, the eastern border of Mexico, in the city of Matamoros, the city of Reynosa border towns. The main leader of this hires this Santero priest to protect the organization, and there is, in my view, a kind of inflationary process where around sacrificial victims, where the Palo Mayombe engages in animal sacrifice, that branch of something engages in animal sacrifice, and it's about nourishing the spirit of a dead person who then becomes kind of obeyed, sort of enslaved to the valero, or the priest, and does things for the priest, and through the priest for the priest's clients, who are usually referred to as godchildren. So that's the first moment of the new cannibalism. Occurs around this group, and it becomes a big scandal because among the people who they killed, in the end was an American sort of corn-fed kind of med student from Austin, Texas, a young man named Kilroy, last name Kilroy, and when they disappeared this guy, all hell broke loose on the American side, and that's how they found the whole group, and the scandal emerged. The first period of sort of cannibalism then is occurring around a human sacrifice, the construction of secrecy for an organization that has become much more complex than it used to be. In other words, the Matamoros traffickers, that's a very old trade. Trafficking on the border exists ever since the US-Mexican border went through there. So smuggling is an old and established trade, but this generation of smugglers, the creators of the Gulf cartel, now have to have connections in the Mexico City airport, in the Cancun airport, all the international ports on the coasts of Mexico, all the way down southward to Colombia, through Central America, and then change their connections within the US. What that meant was that there's a lot of anxiety around the trade, because the group was much larger than it had been before, and needed much more sophisticated connections. The ritual that the Santero priest was asked to do had to do with invisibilizing the group, creating a kind of secrecy. And that's the first moment. The second moment that occurs already a good time later, 15 years later, see the first traces of it in the early 2000s and the mid-2010s, is a case where you have humans, you have cannibalism, but it is shed beyond sacrifice. It's not connected to human sacrifice. The victims, in other words, are people who are getting shot, have been shot. They're not ritually murdered. And the ingestion of a piece of human meat is used as a trial for to test the mettle of new recruits, soldiers, at a moment when a war has started, a war between cartels. We're still in the middle of that. And so the organizations now have to recruit soldiers all over the place. And so to test the mettle of the soldiers, some organizations started taking up cannibalism. The third moment is when ingestion of human meat is publicized through YouTube, up on the web, etc., as a form of terror. The most famous case of that, relatively recent, a few years ago, in the Zacatecas state, when two cartels have been fighting out for some years, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, and it's after a battle, the captain of the Jalisco cartel has defeated a group of Sinaloa people, opens the chest up of one of the fallen soldiers, takes a bite out of the heart on camera in order to challenge, saying, and instill fear in the opponent. And then the fourth moment is when cannibalism starts becoming, emerging ambiguously as an offering in feasts, right? Like, instead of having the raw meat, it's hidden in, for example, in dishes, right? Tamales, for example, right? Or pozole, where you can't really tell exactly what meat it is or it isn't. And the examples of that are places that are completely under the domination of a cartel, where a feast is given, and the content of the tamales or the content of the pozole is actually declared by the drug boss. Says, well, we're here in this meeting and we have a special dish. It involves human meat or something, or in another case, the person's asking what the tamales are from and he says they're human barbecue. But there's no, it's not clear whether this is a joke or whether it's true. And so it's a kind of ambiguous situation where the people who are under the cartel dominance are unsure to what degree they're complicit or not. So that's the case, let's say the opposite of the other one, where you're seeing on camera the heart being taken out and bitten. In this case, we're not sure whether it's actually a case of cannibalism or not, but it is declared to be a case of cannibalism, except not believed necessarily by the people who are there. So that is the arc of the new cannibalism that I described in this book. And I'm now going to talk about this chapter, which is a short chapter, is about invisibility, human sacrifice, and cash and money. Adolfo Jesus Constanzo, who was the Santero priest who I mentioned as sort of head of the so-called narcos satánicos, met Sara Andrede, who was, according to the police, the priestess, which she actually wasn't, and sort of queen of this group, cruising down Matamoros main drive. And he gave her a chase until she finally stopped her car. Those were safer times, no doubt, because Sarah got out of her car and confronted Alpha, which nobody would do today, by the way, asking what it was that he wanted. They immediately struck up a flirtatious conversation and hit it off, so that Sarah consented to meet Adolfo again outside his hotel in order to go together for a jog. Martín was one of Constanzo's two main lovers, and his a ritual assistant in the sacrifices, who as usual was in the car with Adolfo, would also be joining them. They agreed to that. Adolfo then insisted on escorting Sara home, but as Sara didn't want him to know where she lived, she drove to a friend's house rather than to her own and waited there for Adolfo Márquez's car to leave. She then pulled out of her friend's garage and headed home. But then, just as Sarah walked in, the phone rang, and it was Adolfo calling to bid her a good night. I quote from Sara. This is all as parts are offered. A memoir that Sara, who's still in prison today, wrote from prison. Quite a remarkable book. And I haven't given him my phone number, she recalled, which in any case was unlisted. This was an unlisted number. That call rattled Sara, but her alarm mounted when Adolfo appeared on her doorstep the following afternoon. Sara asked Adolfo how he had discovered where she lived, to which he mysteriously responded, I know everything. About you, I know everything. One of Adolfo Jesus Constanzo's most confounding attributes was his uncanny knowledge of others' private lives. Did his access to secrets come from the power of his sorcery, or did it originate in his connections to the police? Was Adolfo's power founded in his secret connection to the spirits, or to his no less secret connection to powerful worldly actors? Was it born from Adolfo's ego, that is his enslaved spirit that is in the cauldron that he fed without sacrifice, or from his network of God children? Put another way, was the relationship between the invisibility that was cultivated in a secret society around the dialogue with the spirits of the dead, and the spirit and the secret of what did it stem from the secrets, from the connection to the spirits of the dead, or the secret knowledge of the state that came along with the secret society? Of course, the wealth cartel is deeply connected to certain control of the world. Police in Matamoros was deeply connected. Federal police and had many political clients, many of whom were Constanzo's clients as well. Written in prison more than 20 years after these events transpired, Sara's memoir leaves readers unsure of the answer. But Sara soon began at least to half believe that Adolfo's powers sprang from his nexus to the spirit world, rather than from his no less mysterious police affiliation he had with his badge. He and Martino had his badge. Sara had always been drawn to spiritual phenomena. But pretty soon, she recalled, I started calling him Merlin. But there was a touch of irony and suspended belief that was implied in that moniker. There was still some skepticism hidden in it. So one day, Adolfo decided to give Sara a practical demonstration of his power. He needed her to have complete faith in him. Suddenly, Adolfo Constanzo chose the Matamoros grounds for the border crossing to make that display. The two were in the car one day, lined up on the Mexican side of the border crossing to the United States, when Adolfo said to Sarah, quote, I'm going to pass in front of that officer, and he won't see me. And he immediately got out of the car and walked freely across the border without the agent looking up at him or asking for his paper. The guard from Stanso was invisible. I realize it's bouncing around. Can you hear me? Back over there. The 16th century construction, I think, is more oriented to Gregorian chants than to actually. Yeah. It's not fortuitous that Adolfo chose a border crossing as an anchored place to show off his powers of invisibility. Smuggling was a matter of special interest to his clients, and since Adolfo himself sometimes paid in marijuana rather than in cash, smuggling was important even within his own social circle. Remember that in Claudio, this is one of his close employees, explained from jail to a journalist Jesus Demos, who was also in jail at the time, that he used an amulet made out of a human vertebra to move his pickup truck across the border undetected. And Dewey worked as a driver and drug trafficker at Rancho Santa Elena, the ranch where they had sacrificed a bunch of people, 12 people, including Márquez. Anthropologist Rihanna has argued that freedom of back and forth movement across the U.S.-Mexico border marks the difference between the middle and the lower classes in contemporary Tijuana. Those legally qualified to move back and forth are viewed as full and upright citizens of Tijuana because acquiring a U.S. visa involves proving that you have a job, a bank account, and no prison record. All relevant factors for thinking of yourself as an upright citizen. In addition, shopping in the United States and having a general acquaintance with that country is a critical status marker in the border region and arguably throughout most of Mexico. The Gulf cartel's desire to attain invisibility in border crossings has a complicated relationship to Diaz's description of the connection between U.S. visas, border crossing, class identification, and legitimate citizenship. In many instances, drug traffickers are able to move across the border legally, and this, in principle, assimilates them to the proudly righteous middle classes living on the Mexican side of the border. Adolfo Constanzo, for instance, was a U.S. citizen by birth. He could move across the border freely. Indeed, had the Immigration Service stopped him on the bridge leading into Brownsville, where he chose to prove his powers of invisibility, nothing would have happened to him. He would have been allowed to cross. Sara, too, could move freely across that border. She was part of Matamoros' establishment class, went to college in Brownsville, had an apartment there. Juan Garcia, the founder of the Gulf Cartel, and the main client of the so-called narcosatánicos, too was born in the United States. So Adolfo's powers weren't geared precisely to providing initiates with a middle-class status, at least in the traditional sense, since traffickers might acquire middle or even upper-class status through their consumer patterns, but not necessarily attain the legal imprimatur that goes together with the ideals of upright citizenship, job, bank account, clean criminal record. Indeed, the invisibility that the narcos in Matamoros sought was not the same as why an undocumented immigrant might desire that same invisibility. As border dwellers, Matamoros traditional drug traffickers could for the most part move across the border legally. Their challenge was not to get themselves across, but rather to move their product, and then to move substantial and legally acquired monies from one side of the border to the other. The invisibility cannibal was broth or amulet made of a bone extracted from the spinal column of a sacrificed person would help in this, apparently. But how exactly did it do so? Constanzo was offering Gulf cartel leadership and selected operatives with a spiritual initiation and fortitude that would help them get away with which array of bruises or tricks. Seen from the viewpoint of a cartel rather than an individual, like in Dewey, the guy who was declared in jail. And spiritual initiation protected the invisibility of an activity whose conditions of possibility already existed and simply needed to be amplified. In Tamaulipas, as in many other regions of Mexico, organized crime is referred to colloquially as la maña, an expression that can be translated, albeit somewhat inexactly, as the ploy, or perhaps the ruse, the ingenuity, or the trick. La maña has devoted no end of ingenuity, both picaresque and high-tech, to go about its business undetected. During the years when the narcosatánicos were in Matamoros, for instance, the Gulf cartel transported profuse amounts of cocaine into the United States as luggage stored inside U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service buses. which was, of course, a perfect visibility ploy. The Chapo Guzman, for his part, became famous for investing in a network of tunnels that he used to get drugs across the Tijuana and San Diego border. Again, several years' worth of trafficking transpired undetected. In their turn, the Zetas transformed the Piedras Negras penitentiary into an industrial shop floor where cars, vans, and trucks were custom fitted with welded compartments made to transport drugs undetected. There's been no shortage of tricks, ploys, and ruses used to hide the traffickers' illegal products. Even so, passing undetected is a constant concern. Criminal organizations such as the Garcia-Avelo's Gulf Cartel sometimes perform tasks in regions where they have limited operational capabilities, which regularly leads them to rely on subcontracting and outsourcing. In other words, they depend on independent operators who carry out transactions, for instance, or on gang members to collect debts, and each subcontractor is a potential liability. Nor does the fear of being discovered end there. Within Mexico, invisibility is achieved by buying or intimidating the police and by making deals with the armed forces. But these deals themselves vanish into thin air, as they did dreadfully for Alonso Constanzo himself. He was killed in the operative that landed in Sana in jail. He bought police force and sell itself to another seller, to a higher bidder, and captured and deported ally and returned with a plea bargain in the United States. The contemporary history of Mexican drug trafficking is replete with traffickers denouncing and taking revenge against police chiefs and state attorney generals who have taken their money and then flipped their alliances to the competition. When a police force transfers its loyalty to a competing crime organization or subordinates itself to a higher state interest, their former patron's invisibility itself disappears. Invisibility vanishes, so to speak. They instantly become a hunted prey. For an organization like the Gulf Cartel of the late 1980s, the obsession of requiring invisibility with regard to their rivals was especially intense. Indeed, fear of infiltration by rivals is a generalized and constant feature of Mexico's organized crime because it's difficult to identify traitors, and the leaders of rival groups always try to take advantage of internal cleavages. So, for instance, the schism between the Gulf Cartel and Zetas, that had once been part of a single organization, spawned an alliance between the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, who had formerly been enemies. Conversely, on the Sinaloa side, the break between the Tranleira brothers and Chapo Guzman, who had both been part of the Sinaloa Federation, led the Tranleiras to build an alliance with the Zetas against the former enemies. Such dynamics of betrayal and alliance run through the history of Mexico's drug wars and are the subject of lore. These factors, then, the challenges of smuggling product across international borders, the vulnerability of distribution operations and enforcement operations within the United States, the possibility of losing control of police and military outlets, and the constant attention to snitches and traitors within the organization made invisibility both an art and an obsession. The narcosatánicos sold ritual services to the Gulf Cartel as a way of helping their boss build a sharp boundary between insiders and outsiders, stealing the insiders by way of a morally disruptive experience, engagement, and sacrifice. In this way, invisibility was protected, but in the process, foundations were laid for the development of a new morality. Many years after, are you with me? Is this going too fast? Are we okay? Is it going too fast? Right. Many years after Alberto's death in the Puente Grande Penitentiary in Jalisco State, journalist Jesus Lemos asked fellow inmate Dumi if it was true that the narcosatánicos had used the bones of their victims to make themselves visible. and they duly responded that he had crossed the border many times without being detected due to his human bone amulet. He also added that Constanzo's reputation spread quickly, specifically because of his work, quote, providing protection and visibility to bullets, and that it was his power that led, quote, a very powerful boss in the region, that is Tamaulipas state, to seek him out to protection work so that, quote, he and his people could work better. And then in Juliana, Jesus Costanzo taught us that when you can be invisible to enemies and bullets will bounce off your body, you can be dead for a while and then revive if you fully comply with the devil worship rites. Here, Ndubi is using this devil thing, which has been introduced in the press and by the police. The former somebody actually does really involve the devil. The journalist had been handed a unique career, that is, his name was the guy who did the interview, had been handed a unique career opportunity when he was imprisoned in the wing of the penitentiary that housed famous criminals. And Lemus could now talk freely from a shared moral space provided by common imprisonment with the protagonist of some of Mexico's most infamous crime. His question on Dubi's take on the efficacy of Costanzo's invisibility charm broached the subject that had been a favorite of the sensationalist press at the time of the scandal, and that it was Satánico's supposed blind faith in their powers of invisibility. And the papers had bloated when Costanzo and his lover Martín succumbed to gunfire rather than vanishing into thin air as they and their followers claimed they could do. Now that he had the chance, journalist Jesus Lemus could finally put public curiosity to rest by asking the by now seriously mentally ill Ndubi specifically about this matter. Did Penarcos Satánicos really believe in the power of it? Ndubi at least still did, but by the time of these confessions, the power of belief was completely spent and was more a subject of psychiatrics or psychiatric specialists than a matter of public interest. At the time that the event transpired, however, the public's horror, incredulity, and fascination with human sacrifice, cannibalism, Satanism, invisibility, and drug trafficking was also found enthusiastic by the police. Indeed, the outlandish and certainly illegal bonfire exorcism performed by the Matamoros police on key material evidence at the Santa Elena Ranch was one example of the police using cannibalism, allegedly inspired by Satanism, in order itself to disappear as a relative conspirator. This is an event that's explained in the previous chapter. When the scandal breaks out, Costanzo and a group of his friends are hiding out. They take a couple of weeks to find them. They finally find them here in Mexico City. And the police in Matamoros did this weird exorcism at the site of the altar of the Narcos Satánicos in the ranch where they had sacrificed and buried their victims. And with a priest and everything, the cross, they did it, the whole thing, they went all the way with it. And in the process, of course, destroyed whatever evidence there was in the place. They did this, by the way, before even catching Costanzo. They did this while the others were still on the run. The police's objective was to destroy any evidence that might tie Costanzo to his own office, to the politicians who he had initiated, or to Costanzo's clients in the Gulf cartel. The moment when the vicar of a Matamoros-based secret society became publicly notorious, all the ties that Adolfo had with his godchildren had to be made visible. The police and its allies in the press were charged with this particular magic trick. In Sara's memoir, she reports a conversation that transpired between Martin and Adolfo. These are the two lovers and Martin and Adolfo, the priest and maid. After the Santa Elena Ranch discoveries were made public, when they were all on the run, where Martin discussed concerns that would very soon inspire and explain the police's actions. This is Martin talking to the priest and his lover, Constanzo. You're a very trusting person, but don't forget where your godchildren's positions are, or the jobs that they hold. They're not going to allow anyone to sully their reputation. Spanish, que se les desprestigio. And then there's also your goddaughters, the famous ones. Imagine the scandal if it becomes known that they participated in these rituals. Don't forget that they're dyed in the wool of Catholics, Católicas de Hueso Colorado in Spanish. Martin was noting a simple truth. The instant that Adolfo's ritual practice became public would also be the moment when Adolfo and his dependents would be left alone, abandoned by all his powerful godchildren. The police were charged with keeping Constanzo's clientele invisible, and they could be trusted with the mission because they themselves had ties to the Gulf cartel. The prestidigitation required to divorce suspects from their social connections was for the police a matter of routine. Mexico's police was in the business of extortion and looting, and so of destroying evidence for its own benefit and gain. Did the police use the wizard's ledger books, which never appeared that included the names of his clients, to extort his godchildren? We don't know. But the fact that none of Constanzo's clients were interrogated suggests the possibility of police extortion, with or without the ledgers. The police had diverted the press's attention away from the Gulf cartel and its political allies. To famous Mexico City artist, Constanzo had been a priest here in Mexico City before being hired by the Gulf cartel and moved into Matamoros. And here he moved in the Zona Rosa, which at that time was kind of the Bohemian neighborhood, and had a lot of clients who were businessmen or artists. So the police had diverted the press's attention away from the Gulf cartel and its political allies to famous Mexico City artists who were alleged at one time or another to have consulted Adolfo, thus leading the scandal to obfuscate the true nature of the crime. This sort of smokescreen was, to a degree, a routine procedure for Mexico's judicial so-called investigative police. But going to the lengths of performing a public exorcism and burning the evidence present at the scene of the crime, that was unusual. Indeed, this police auto de fe extravaganza provides a clue to the efficacy of Constanzo's rituals of invisibilization, for belief in the power of Adolfo's sorcery allowed the Matamoros police to make their own participation in rituals invisible. The police thereby directed the attention induced by the dread and fascination inspired by cannibalism away from himself and the cartel and toward Constanzo and his ritual assistants, who they baptized as a narco-satanic sect. And so, instead of being investigated for their role in the business of providing spiritual protection for the Gulf cartel, the cult alone was made to bear all responsibility for the atrocities that were carried out at the Santa Elena ranch. I still got a couple more pages, but if my sense of a little degree of exhaustion, should I maybe stop there and leave it open, or do you have stamina for a little more? Stop there, I don't have, it's a little dark out there, I don't have the correct feeling whether the echo is getting to be a bit much. Should I? Yeah, it is maybe? Okay. I'll stop there. There's the sections that I didn't read are the use of the dead as protectors. Then maybe I'll just read the analysis, short part of analysis, and I'll stop there. The next part that I'm not reading to is the police's torture of Sara and what they're trying to get out of her in the process of torture. And in the process of torturing her, they actually kind of make her, they make her lie on in the, how do you call it, like, plancha platform where Adolfo Constanzo, who lately was her boyfriend, had been open an autopsy body. They make her kiss his lips, and then they bring some organs from Martin and put it to her mouth to sort of tell her, ask her to confess with her. That is how they had eaten people before. That's the kind of cannibalism. So there was this, part of it was this kind of reliving the story that the police had told through torture. And the other part was to try to get her to confess the information on Constanzo's bank accounts, because Constanzo had a lot of money, and there's all this stuff about money that is happening. So that's the part that you didn't hear, that discusses all that. If Sara's Mexico City tortures had been Constanzo's initiates, that is, her tortures in the police had been already initiated by Constanzo, which is possible, not likely, but possible. Then the bizarre nuptials that they made her carry out with Adolfo's corpse would unquestionably have been a deliberate kind of trampling not only of the wizard's body, but also of the power of his ego, that is, of his dead spirit that he controlled, who had failed to protect Adolfo, and was now failing miserably to protect Sara. But the police's horrible inversion of Adolfo's protection ritual may perfectly well have been unintentional. It is unlikely, but by no means impossible, that Sara's torturer in chief was acquainted with Adolfo, or that the twisted and sinister parallels between his joining of Sara with dead Adolfo and Adolfo's joining of Sara with his egun, with his dead spirit he controlled, was a deliberate mockery and triumph over Adolfo's santeria on the part of the police. The grotesque inversion of Adolfo's protection ritual can also have been induced simply by police's collusion and participation in the same space of invisibility that Constanzo was protecting. Its known complicity with Juan Garcia Arego's Gulf cartel. Remember that Adolfo himself had judicial police badge, which means that the judicial police, were directly connected. Indeed, there are structural components of the police's connection with the criminal underworld that do not require any acquaintance with rituals such as those performed by Adolfo Constanzo to produce tortures that so uncannily double the Santero's ritual practice. The cloak of invisibility is required to forge relationships between the entrepreneurs of a massively lucrative legal business and the police. Such business must be able to keep a lid on the required and indispensable relationships between, quote, the cartel, the police, and various officers and politicians that business requires. Due to the lack of state-protected contracts, such vows of silence are always taken in the face of death. That is, so you don't need to have the egun in front of you. In other words, you don't need to have the candle with ghosts of captive spirit in it. And to have all these acts done with death present. Because of all these pacts, since they're not protected contractually, they're not protected by the state, are done under pain of either one's own death, if one transgresses the agreement, or of the death of one's family, or both. And taking the spell of silence and breaking the spell of silence that is sealed in the imminent presence, in the imminent presence of death, leads to the immediate collapse of the conspiracy, the prompt disappearance of its invisibility, and therefore of the state's protection or tolerance of the conspiracy. Exposed conspirators instantly become targets who, once they are made visible to the public eye, become the scapegoats that the state requires in order to uphold its image as the guardian of the law. The connection between silence and the dead is thus there from the beginning, regardless of its specific elaboration in Valero Santeria. Forcing Sarah to make no kiss or ingest the autopsy corpses of Adolfo and Martin was thus an especially brutal way of performing her absolute lack of protection. All the secrets the police thought she kept for Adolfo were now hers alone. And if she handed them to the police, she would be released from their torture. Now, miserable though it was, the state would be her own possible source of protection.